My husband, David, always had a way with words. Our secret phrase, the one he'd whisper just to me, was, "Our story is written in the stars." For 5 years after he was gone, I thought that story had reached its final chapter. I was a widow, a mother, a grandmother, but I'd forgot how to be the main character in my own life. And then, a stranger at a coffee shop, with kind eyes and a familiar smile, looked at me and said something that changed everything he said. "I have a feeling our story is written in the stars." For 5 years, my world had gone quiet. After 35 years of marriage, David's absence wasn't just an empty space in our bed. It was a silence that echoed through every room of the house we'd built together. At 63, I was living a life I had never planned for. My days were structured, filled with errands, calls with my kids, Sarah and Tom, and doting on my grandchildren. But the nights were the hardest. Loneliness is a heavy blanket in the dark. To feel close to him, I started a little ritual. Every Tuesday and Friday, I'd go to the daily grind, the small cafe downtown, where David and I had spent so many Saturday mornings. I'd sit at our table, the small two-top by the window, and order the same thing: one Earl Grey tea and a slice of lemon pound cake, his favorite. It was my way of keeping our memories alive, of sitting with his ghost for a little while. David was a planner. Even when he was sick, his biggest worry was always me. I remember one afternoon, sitting on the porch, he took my hand. His was so frail. He looked at me with that steady gaze of his and said something I've never forgotten. "Elena," he said, "he'd hate to see you spend your last years sitting alone in that corner. You know," he always said, "she deserves someone who looks at her like she's the whole world." He had this funny little quirk of talking about himself in the third person when he was trying to be serious. And he was serious. He wanted me to find happiness again. But I never told anyone he said that. Not my sister, not my best friend, and certainly not our kids. It felt too sacred, like a final instruction I didn't know how to follow. How could I even think about another man looking at me that way? The very idea felt like a betrayal. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that I first noticed him. He was sitting a few tables away, a man who looked to be around my age. He had silver hair, kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled at the barista, and just a calm, settled presence about him. He was always there, reading a book or writing in a small leather-bound journal. Our first real interaction was nothing special. He held the door for me as I was leaving. "Have a good day," he said, his voice gentle. The next week, I fumbled with my wallet, dropping a cascade of coins on the floor. Before I could even protest, he was kneeling and helping me gather them. "Happens to the best of us," he chuckled, placing the last dime into my palm. His hand was warm. I learned his name was Arthur, and we fell into a comfortable pattern of small talk. We'd chat about the weather, the coffee, the books we were reading. It was easy. There was something familiar about him, the way he'd patiently listen, nodding his head, pausing thoughtfully before he spoke. It reminded me so much of David that a sharp pang of guilt shot through me. I told myself it was just a coincidence. I was just a lonely widow, projecting memories onto a friendly stranger. I was safe in that thought. Or so I believed. Then came the day he said it. The phrase, "Our story is written in the stars," he said it so casually, a passing thought as we talked about old black and white movies. But for me, the world just stopped. I must have gone pale, because his smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "Are you all right, Elena?" he asked. I could only nod, unable to speak. How could he know? It was our secret, David's and mine. A phrase whispered during our wedding dance, written in every anniversary card, murmured in the dark. No one knew. After that day, something shifted. I couldn't dismiss him as just a kind stranger anymore. The mystery of it all pulled me in, even as fear and guilt screamed at me to run the other way. I started looking forward to Tuesdays and Fridays with a nervous flutter I hadn't felt in decades. Our conversations grew longer, drifting from small talk into the deeper parts of our lives. He told me he was a widower. His wife had passed away 3 years ago after a long illness. We talked about the strange landscape of grief and the crushing weight of loneliness that you can only understand if you've been through it. We also talked about the practical fears that come at our age about retirement funds, the rising cost of living, and the quiet dread of having a health scare when you live alone. He confessed his fear of being a burden on his son. I confessed mine of my children seeing me as fragile. It was a profound comfort to share these unglamorous, terrifying truths with someone who just nodded and said, "I know exactly what you mean." I kept noticing more echoes of David, too. Arthur had the same quiet chuckle. He'd fold his paper napkin into a neat little square, just like David. He even liked his coffee the same way. Each discovery was a strange mix of comfort and treason. It felt like the universe was sending me signs, but my heart felt like it was cheating on a memory. This growing connection was becoming a source of both hope and overwhelming guilt. Feeling a warmth I hadn't realized I was missing, I decided to tell my children. I thought they'd be happy for me. I couldn't have been more wrong. I brought it up casually during our weekly Sunday dinner. "I've met someone," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "A friend. From the cafe." The reaction was immediate and cold. My son, Tom, who was always so protective, put his fork down. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Dad's only been gone 5 years. Sarah, my daughter, was quieter, but her disappointment was just as loud. "It just seems fast," she said, twisting her napkin. "Are you sure this is a good idea? You're vulnerable right now." It went downhill from there. They worried about my finances, questioning if Arthur might be after the house or David's pension. They talked about protecting their father's legacy, about how it would feel to see another man in his home. "We're just worried he might take advantage of you," Mom Tom said. His voice softened a little, but the accusation hung in the air. I tried to explain that Arthur was just a kind man, a widower himself, but they couldn't see past their own grief. It felt like they were accusing me of not just poor judgment, but of trying to replace their father. I went to bed that night feeling more alone than ever. Was my happiness selfish? Was I betraying David and hurting the children we raised together? A week later, a text from Arthur lit up my phone. "Tired of the cafe? How about a walk in the park on Saturday? The roses are in full bloom." My first instinct was to say no. My children's disapproval was still ringing in my ears. Going on what felt like a real date seemed like a confirmation of their worst fears. I typed and deleted a polite refusal 3 times. But then, I thought of the lonely nights and of David's words. With trembling fingers, I typed, "I would love that." The walk was easy. Away from the cafe, we were just 2 people enjoying a sunny afternoon. The conversation flowed. Surrounded by the scent of roses, I opened up in a way I hadn't with anyone. I told him about David's illness and the hollow feeling of being a caregiver who suddenly has no one to care for. I even told him David had wanted me to be happy again, though I kept his exact words to myself. I felt a knot in my chest loosen, but the peace didn't last. That evening, Sarah called. Her voice was tight with a forced calm that was worse than yelling. "Mom, Tom said you went out with that man today. We saw you at the park. We need you to think about what you're doing." To Dad, to us, "If you keep seeing him, I don't think I can bring the kids over for a while. It's just too confusing for them." The threat, however gently delivered, was a punch to the gut. My grandchildren are my world. The idea of not seeing them was unbearable. I ended the call, my hand shaking, tears streaming down my face. She was asking me to choose, my children or this fragile, newfound hope. I had to end it with Arthur. It was too complicated, too painful. My story, it seemed, was destined to end in solitude after all. I spent 2 days in a miserable fog, avoiding my phone. But I knew I owed Arthur an explanation. I agreed to meet him one last time at the cafe, our place. I rehearsed my goodbye speech the whole way there. I sat down across from him. He must have seen the despair on my face. Before I could start my speech, the words just tumbled out, all the confusion, guilt, and heartbreak. I told him about my children, their ultimatum, and the feeling that I was betraying David's memory. I love my children more than anything, I finished, my voice cracking. And I still love my husband. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's just wrong. Arthur listened, his gaze never leaving mine. He let the silence hang for a long moment. Then, he leaned forward. "Elena," he said softly, "he'd hate to see you spend your last years sitting alone in that corner. You know," he always said, "she deserves someone who looks at her like she's the whole world." The world went silent. The clatter of cups, the murmur of conversations, it all faded away. It was the phrase, the sacred, secret phrase David had said on the porch. The words I had never told a soul. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't possible. "How?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "How could you possibly know that?" Arthur's eyes were misty. He took a slow breath, and the story that unfolded was more beautiful and heartbreaking than I could have imagined. He told me he hadn't known David well. But for a few months, during the last year of David's life, they were both cafe regulars. David's appointments were in the mornings, and he'd come to the cafe afterward to have a moment to himself. Arthur was recently retired, and the cafe was his escape. 2. They struck up a conversation one day, the way strangers do. Over several weeks, they talked. Arthur said men of their generation don't often talk about personal things, but there was an honesty between them. David spoke about his illness, but mostly, he spoke about me. One day, David showed Arthur a faded photo of me from our 25th anniversary. He told Arthur about my strength, my kindness, and his deep worry about me being alone. And then he said the words, "She deserves someone who looks at her like she's the whole world." David made Arthur promise that if, by some 1,000,000 to 1 chance, he ever ran into a woman named Alina, who sat at this very table, he would tell her that her husband wanted her to live fully. As for the other phrase, "Our story is written in the stars," Arthur just shook his head in wonder. That, he said, I have no explanation for. When we were talking that day, it just came to me. It felt right. I suppose some things are just meant to be. It wasn't magic. It was a final, loving act from my husband, passed through the hands of a kind stranger who had the patience to wait, to slowly get to know me, to make sure the message was delivered with care. Listening to Arthur, I felt 5 years of guilt lift from my shoulders. It was as if David himself was there with us, giving me his blessing. This wasn't a betrayal. It was the fulfillment of his dying wish. This wasn't replacing him. It was honoring a love so strong it reached across time and death, to make sure I wasn't alone. My decision was clear. The conversation with my children was difficult, but this time, my voice didn't shake. With Arthur's permission, I sat them down and told them the whole story about David's conversations with Arthur. The phrases, the unbelievable way it all came together. I told them gently but firmly, I am not choosing between your father and Arthur. I am choosing to keep living. Loving your father was the story of the first half of my life. Maybe this is the beginning of a new chapter. It doesn't erase the ones that came before. It wasn't an overnight fix. Tom is still wary. But Sarah cried. She saw the peace in my eyes and understood. Last Sunday, she brought the grandchildren over for dinner, and she told me to set an extra plate. Change is slow, and family is complicated, but for the first time in 5 years, my house was filled not with the echo of loneliness, but with the quiet hum of hope. Love, I've learned, doesn't get smaller when it's shared. The love I have for David is a permanent part of me. But my heart, it turns out, had more room than I thought. It had room for a new story, a different kind of love that honors the past while embracing the future. Finding companionship again doesn't mean you're forgetting the one you lost. It means you've remembered how to live. Sometimes, a second chance shows up in the most unexpected way, in an ordinary cafe, with a secret message you were always meant to receive. Have you ever had to choose between your family's wishes and your own heart, or found a sign from a loved one when you least expected it? I would be truly honored to read your stories in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more real stories about love, loss, and second chances, I hope